I staged my death after the Alpha's betrayal. Now I'm back to claim his throne and his pack. The knife was already at her throat when Elena Hartley realized the wedding had been a trap from the very beginning. She did not scream. Screaming would have wasted the one breath she needed to think. The hand gripping her wrist belonged to Nathan Cole, a man she had trusted since she was 16 years old, a man who had once carried her on his shoulders through the training fields and called her little sister. Now his fingers dug into her skin hard enough to bruise, and his eyes held nothing she recognized. "Don't fight this, Elena," he said quietly, so quietly that the music and laughter from the reception hall 200 feet away swallowed his words whole. "It will be easier if you don't fight." 10 minutes earlier, she had been standing in a small stone room behind the great hall, smoothing the front of a wedding dress that was not meant for her. She was supposed to be married that night. She was supposed to become the mate of Damian Cross, Alpha of the Ashwood Pack, a bond that had been promised to her since she was a child, sealed in blood and old law by her grandmother and his father, before either of them had grown into their titles. For years, she had told herself this marriage was not about love. It was about duty, about keeping two bloodlines strong, about the kind of peace that packs like theirs needed to survive, in a world that was shrinking and turning more dangerous by the year. She had told herself she was ready for a marriage without love. She had never once imagined she would need to be ready for a marriage that was itself the weapon meant to destroy her. It was Oliver Bennett who told her the truth, and he told her with shaking hands and a face gone the color of ash. "You cannot walk into that hall tonight," he had said, pulling her into the stone room the moment she arrived, before her attendants could finish pinning the last of the flowers into her hair. "Elena, listen to me. This wedding is not what you think it is." She had laughed at first, a short disbelieving laugh, because Oliver had always been dramatic, always finding shadows where there were none, but his hands did not stop shaking, and when he told her what he had overheard 2 nights before, standing outside Damian's study with a tray of untouched food he had been too afraid to bring in, the laughter died in her throat. Damian was not marrying her to unite their bloodlines. He was marrying her to end them. The moment the vows were spoken and the bond was sealed, her claim to the Northern Territories, the land and lakes and hunting grounds that had belonged to her family for 6 generations, would transfer entirely into Ashwood hands. Not shared, not united, transferred. And once the transfer was complete, once the ink and the blood and the old magic had done their work, Elena Hartley would no longer be useful to anyone. Oliver had heard Damian's beta, a broad, quiet man named Ethan Reeves, ask the question outright. "What happens to her after the ceremony?" And Damian had answered without hesitation, "She will not be a problem for long." Elena had not believed it, could not believe it. Damian Cross, whatever his faults, had grown up beside her. They had learned to hunt together as children, had shared secrets under the same old oak tree at the edge of the training grounds, had once made a foolish promise at 14 years old, that whoever married first would stand as witness for the other. She had spent years convincing herself that whatever warmth had existed between them as children had simply cooled into something practical, something built on respect rather than affection. She had never once considered that it might have curdled into something else entirely. But Oliver had never lied to her. Not once, not in the 15 years she had known him. "I need to see for myself," she had told him, and against every warning in his voice, she had slipped out of the stone room and moved through the servant corridors of Ashwood Hall until she reached the narrow passage behind Damian's study, the same passage Oliver had used 2 nights before. The door was not fully closed. Voices drifted through the gap, low and businesslike, the voices of men discussing a transaction rather than a wedding. "The moment the bond seals, the paperwork goes through," Ethan Reeves was saying. "Legal, clean, unbreakable. Nobody will question the transfer once she's mated to him. And afterward?" This was a woman's voice, cool and unfamiliar. "You said you had a plan for afterward." "I have people who understand how to make an accident look like an accident," Damian said. His voice was flat, businesslike, the voice of a man discussing weather patterns rather than the death of the woman he was about to marry. "It will be handled quietly. Grief-stricken widower, tragic loss. The whole territory will mourn with me, for exactly as long as it takes to secure the borders." Elena had stood frozen in the passage, one hand pressed against the cold stone wall, and felt something inside her chest crack cleanly in half. She did not remember walking back to the stone room. She did not remember what she said to Oliver when she returned, though he told her later that she had not said anything at all, that she had simply stood in the doorway, with her wedding dress glowing white in the candlelight, and her face gone completely still, the stillness of someone who has just watched their entire future collapse into ash. There had been no time to plan carefully. The ceremony was set to begin within the hour, and any sign of hesitation would have drawn suspicion immediately. Oliver, thinking faster than she could in that moment, had suggested the only option that made any sense. She would go through with the appearance of preparing for the ceremony, and when the moment came to walk the aisle, she would instead slip through the eastern garden gate, where Oliver had already arranged a horse and a change of clothes, hidden 3 days earlier when he first began to suspect something was wrong, though even he had not known exactly what. It should have worked. It nearly did. She had made it to the garden gate, had her hand on the cold iron latch, when Nathan Cole stepped out of the shadows with 2 other enforcers behind him, men she recognized as some of Damien's most loyal guards. "I'm sorry, Elena," Nathan had said, and for one terrible second she saw real regret in his face before it hardened back into duty. Orders are orders. Now, with his hand around her wrist, and a blade close enough that she could feel the cold of it against her skin, Elena understood that there would be no reasoning with him. Nathan Cole had made his choice long before tonight. Whatever loyalty he had once held for her had been traded for whatever Damien promised him in return for his silence and his obedience. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "Somewhere quiet," Nathan said. "Somewhere, it will look like you got frightened and ran. Somewhere with a cliff and a storm coming in, so nobody asks too many questions when they don't find a body right away." The storm. She had noticed it earlier that evening. Dark clouds building over the northern ridge, the kind of storm that rolled in off the coast twice a year, and turned the cliff paths into slick, treacherous ribbons of stone. It was, she realized with a horror that nearly buckled her knees, the perfect weather for an accident. Nobody would question a young woman, overwhelmed by the pressure of her wedding night, wandering too close to the cliff edge in a storm and losing her footing. Grief would be genuine on the surface. The truth would be buried along with her. They marched her through the back trails, away from the lit windows of Ashwood Hall, away from the music and the laughter that still drifted faintly on the wind, a cruel reminder that inside that hall, people were still celebrating a wedding that both of the men escorting her knew would never take place. The other enforcers said nothing. Only Nathan spoke, and only once more, his voice low enough that the others could not hear. "He didn't want it to be like this," Nathan said, "for what it's worth." "Then why is it like this?" Elena asked. Nathan did not answer. The path grew steeper as they climbed toward the northern cliffs, the wind picking up, carrying the first cold sting of rain. Elena's mind raced through every possibility, every angle of escape, and found nothing. She was outnumbered, unarmed, and dressed in a wedding gown that tangled around her legs with every step. She thought of her grandmother, who had negotiated this alliance with such hope for peace. She thought of the northern territories, the lakes and forests that had belonged to her family for 200 years, soon to belong to the man who had ordered her murder. She thought, strangely, of the old oak tree where she and Damien used to sit as children, and wondered when exactly the boy who once shared his lunch with her, because she had forgotten hers, had become the man walking toward this outcome, without so much as a flicker of hesitation. They reached the cliff just as the storm broke fully open above them, rain slashing sideways in the wind, lightning briefly illuminating the churning water far below. Nathan's grip on her wrist did not loosen. "I really am sorry," he said, and this time his voice cracked slightly, the first genuine break in his composure all night. "Then let me go," Elena said, and for one desperate moment, she thought she saw doubt flicker across his face. It was not enough. One of the other enforcers, impatient and clearly less troubled by conscience than Nathan, stepped forward and shoved her from behind. The push was hard, sudden, timed with a violent gust of wind that made the ground beneath her feet feel like it disappeared entirely. There was no cliff edge slow enough to catch herself against. There was only the sudden absence of solid ground, the scream she finally allowed herself in that last half-second, and then the long, terrible drop into darkness, rain, and the roaring black water below. The last thing she heard, faint and already far above her, was Nathan Cole, shouting her name into the storm, as though calling for her now could undo what had already been done. Elena did not remember hitting the water. She remembered cold, an absolute bone-deep cold that stole the air from her lungs before she could even attempt to swim. She remembered being pulled under by a current, stronger than anything she had ever fought against, tumbling helplessly in the dark, her wedding dress dragging at her limbs like hands trying to hold her beneath the surface. She remembered, somewhere in that chaos, deciding that she was not ready to die, not like this, not for a crime that was not her own, not so that Damien Cross could inherit her family's land with clean hands and a grieving public face. She did not remember reaching the shore. She did not remember the hours that followed. When awareness returned to her, slow and fragmented, she was lying on rocky ground far down the coastline, wrapped in a rough blanket that smelled of wood smoke, and a woman, with sharp gray eyes and silver-streaked hair, was kneeling beside her, pressing careful hands against her ribs to check for breaks. "You're lucky," the woman said, in a voice that carried the weight of someone who had seen a great many unlucky things. "The current usually keeps what it takes." Elena tried to speak, and managed only a rasping cough, her throat raw from the water and the cold. "Don't try to talk yet," the woman said. "You're safe. My name is Sophie Marsh. You washed up about 2 miles down from the cliffs, near our camp. My people found you before the tide could pull you back out." Elena's mind, still fogged with cold and shock, latched onto one clear and burning thought, sharper than the pain in her ribs, sharper than the cold still gripping her bones. "They think I'm dead." And in that moment, lying broken and shivering on a rocky shore 2 miles from the cliff where she had been thrown to her death, Elena Hartley made a decision that would take years to fully unfold. She would let them keep believing it. Sophie Marsh's camp turned out to be more than a simple gathering of survivors. It was a settlement of exiled shifters, people who had been cast out of their birth packs, for reasons ranging from political disagreements to simple bad luck. People who had learned to live outside the rigid hierarchies of pack law, and had built something quieter and more self-sufficient in the process. They asked few questions of newcomers, a policy that had clearly kept many of them alive over the years, and when Elena finally found the strength to speak again, 3 days after she was pulled from the water, she gave them only a partial truth. She told them her name was Wren. She told them she had escaped a marriage that would have destroyed her, that the people who tried to kill her believed they had succeeded, and that she intended to keep it that way for as long as necessary. She did not tell them she was the last true heir of the Hartley bloodline. She did not tell them the size of the territory that now sat in Damien Cross's hands, stolen through a lie and a fall from a cliff. Some truths, she understood instinctively, were too dangerous to hand to strangers, no matter how kind their care had been. Sophie Marsh studied her for a long moment after she finished speaking, her sharp gray eyes missing nothing, and then nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had already suspected. "Wren," she repeated. "All right, whatever name you carry, you're welcome to stay as long as you need, but I'll tell you this for free. A person doesn't wash up half-drowned in a wedding dress with enforcers' bruises around her wrist, unless somebody powerful wanted her gone. If you're planning on staying quiet forever, that's your business. But if you're planning on going back one day, you're going to need to become someone very different from the woman who fell off that cliff." Elena, lying on a thin cot in a canvas tent with rain still drumming faintly against the roof, felt something shift inside her chest, something that was not quite grief, and not quite anger, but a strange, cold combination of both, hardening slowly into resolve. "I'm not planning on staying quiet forever," she said. Sophie Marsh smiled for the first time since Elena had woken. A small, sharp smile that held no warmth but a great deal of understanding. "Good," she said, "then get some rest. Healing takes time, and so does becoming someone new. We'll start in the morning." Outside the tent, the storm that had swallowed Elena Hartley whole was finally beginning to fade, the wind softening, the rain slowing to a light patter against the canvas. 2 miles up the coast, in the great hall of Ashwood territory, the wedding guests had long since gone home, whispering to one another about the bride who had vanished into the storm, about search parties combing the cliffs at dawn, about the tragedy of a young woman lost on what should have been the happiest night of her life. Damien Cross stood at the cliff's edge as the sun rose, staring down at the churning gray water, his face unreadable to anyone who watched him. Whether what he felt in that moment was grief or relief, no one standing near him could say for certain, and he offered no explanation. The search parties found nothing. No body ever washed ashore near Ashwood territory. Within a week, the northern lands that had belonged to the Hartley family for 6 generations were formally absorbed into Ashwood Holdings, the paperwork moving through with unusual speed for a grieving Alpha, and the pack settled into a quiet, uneasy peace that no one dared question too loudly. 2 miles down the coast, in a camp hidden among the rocks and windswept trees, a woman who no longer answered to the name Elena Hartley began, slowly and deliberately, to heal. The first thing Sophie Marsh took from her was the wedding dress. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. On the morning after the storm, Sophie folded the ruined white fabric into a canvas bag and told Wren, without much ceremony, that it would be burned before midday. "You can't build a new life while you're still wearing the old one," she said, setting a plain gray tunic and a pair of worn leather boots at the foot of the cot. "Clothes remember who you were. We need you to forget." Wren did not argue. She watched from the tent flap as Sophie tossed the dress into the camp's central fire pit that evening, watched the fine white silk curl and blacken, and disappear into smoke that drifted out over the cliffs toward the water that had nearly killed her. She felt nothing as it burned. She told herself later that the nothing was the first sign of healing, though in truth it was something closer to numbness, a wall her mind had built because the alternative, feeling the full weight of what had happened, would have broken her completely. The camp itself sat tucked into a narrow cove, protected on 3 sides by steep rock walls, invisible from the coastal road above, unless a person knew exactly where to look. Sophie explained, during Wren's first full week of recovery, that the location had been chosen deliberately. Every person living there had a reason to stay hidden. Some had been exiled from their birth packs for challenging leadership and losing. Others had simply walked away from lives that had become unbearable, choosing the uncertainty of exile over the safety of a cage. A handful, like Sophie herself, had been born into this life, the children of exiles who had never known any pack at all. There was an older man, named Henry Doyle, who ran the camp's modest infirmary, a broad-shouldered former enforcer who had lost his rank years earlier after refusing to carry out an order he considered dishonorable. There was a sharp-tongued young woman named Ivy Sinclair, barely older than Wren, who handled most of the camp's trading with nearby human settlements, exchanging furs and herbs for supplies the camp could not produce on its own. There was a quiet man named Daniel Pierce, who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, but who Wren noticed, over the following weeks, seemed to know more about the political workings of the wider shifter world than anyone else in the camp, information he gathered through channels he never fully explained. It was Henry who first noticed that Wren's injuries were healing at a pace that seemed unusual, even for a shifter. "You're strong," he told her, pressing careful fingers along a rib that had been badly bruised in the fall, and was already knitting back together, far faster than it should have. "Stronger than you look. Whoever trained you, they trained you well before all this happened." Wren said nothing, but the observation lodged itself in her mind. She had spent years training under the assumption that her strength would be used to defend a marriage, a territory, a peace that turned out to be built on nothing but ambition. Now, for the first time, she began to wonder what that same strength might accomplish if she stopped waiting for someone else to give her purpose and started deciding for herself what she wanted to become. The decision did not arrive all at once. It arrived slowly, over the course of many quiet mornings spent sitting on the rocks above the cove, watching the water that had once nearly swallowed her whole. She thought often of Nathan Cole's voice cracking in the storm, of the genuine regret she had seen flicker across his face before duty overrode it. She thought of Oliver Bennett, who had risked everything to warn her, and who now, as far as anyone at Ashwood knew, was mourning a friend who had drowned on her wedding night. She wondered whether Oliver suspected the truth, whether some part of him held on to hope that she had survived, or whether he too believed the water had taken her for good. She thought, more than she wanted to admit, of Damien Cross, standing at the edge of that cliff, ordering her death with the same flat tone he might have used to order dinner. 3 weeks after the storm, Wren asked Sophie Marsh to begin training her properly. "You're already strong," Sophie pointed out, watching Wren move through a series of basic combat drills in the small clearing behind the camp's main tents, drills that Wren executed with a precision that clearly surprised her. "Strong isn't enough," Ren said. I need to be better than strong. I need to be someone nobody recognizes, in every way that matters. Sophie studied her for a long moment, arms crossed, the wind pulling loose strands of silver-streaked hair across her face. This is about going back, isn't it? Whatever happened to you, whoever did this to you, you're planning on standing in front of them again someday. Not someday, Ren said. Eventually. When I'm ready. When I have something more than anger to bring with me. Anger alone gets people killed, Sophie said. I've seen it happen more times than I can count. Exiles who spend years dreaming of revenge, who finally go back, and who die within a week because rage made them careless. Then teach me not to be careless, Ren said. Teach me everything. I'll do the rest. There was something in her voice, some quiet, unshakable steadiness, that seemed to convince Sophie more thoroughly than any argument could have. The older woman nodded slowly, the same small, sharp smile from that first night returning to her face. All right, Ren, she said. We'll teach you. But understand something first. What we teach here isn't pack combat. It isn't the disciplined, honorable style you were probably raised on, all clean strikes and formal challenges. Out here, we teach people to survive against opponents who outnumber them, who have resources they don't have, who won't fight fair because they've never needed to. If you want that kind of training, you need to be ready to unlearn some of what you already know. I'm ready, Ren said, and she meant it more fully than she had meant anything in months. The training that followed was unlike anything Ren had experienced in her sheltered years at Ashwood and in her own family's territory. Henry Doyle taught her to read an opponent's weight shift half a second before they moved, a skill honed over decades as an enforcer who had faced down far larger and stronger fighters and learned to compensate through timing rather than raw power. Ivy Sinclair, surprisingly skilled with a blade despite her sharp tongue and easy laugh, taught her how to use ordinary objects as weapons, how a length of rope or a broken bottle or a fistful of dirt could turn the tide of a fight when nothing else was available. Sophie herself focused on something less physical but no less important, teaching Ren how to read a room full of strangers, how to gather information without asking direct questions, how to build a false identity so convincing that even people who had known Elena Hartley for years would look directly at Ren and see nothing familiar at all. Daniel Pierce, quiet and watchful as ever, contributed in his own way. He began bringing Ren small pieces of information from the wider shifter world, carried back from his mysterious trading trips along the coast. He told her, several months into her training, that the Ashwood Pack had absorbed the northern Hartley territories with unusual speed following her disappearance, that Damian Cross had married the woman he had originally intended to marry instead of her, a woman named Grace Sullivan from a wealthy allied pack, and that the Union had strengthened Ashwood's political position considerably. Ren absorbed this information without visible reaction, though something cold and hard settled deeper into her chest with every detail. Grace Sullivan. The name meant nothing to her personally, but the fact of the marriage meant everything. It confirmed what Oliver had overheard that night outside Damian's study. The wedding to her had never been about uniting bloodlines or honoring old promises. It had been a calculated step in a plan that had already accounted for a second, more advantageous marriage waiting in the wings. There's something else, Daniel said one evening, several months after she had first arrived at the camp, his voice carrying a note of caution that immediately caught her attention. Word is spreading that not everyone inside Ashwood is happy with how things turned out. There's a faction, mostly older pack members, who thought the marriage to you should have gone forward as planned, according to the old law. Some of them are unhappy with how quickly the northern territories were absorbed. A few are even saying, quietly, that the whole situation felt rushed, suspicious. Do they suspect what really happened? Ren asked. Not that I've heard, Daniel said, but cracks like that don't stay small forever. Pack loyalty holds until it doesn't, and once people start asking questions in private, it's usually only a matter of time before someone asks them out loud. Ren turned this information over carefully in the following weeks, examining it from every angle, the way Sophie had taught her to examine any piece of intelligence before acting on it. Cracks within Ashwood's own ranks meant potential allies, people who might, given the right circumstances and the right proof, turn against Damian Cross without needing to be convinced by Ren herself. It meant the throne she intended to reclaim someday might be standing on ground far less stable than Damian believed. It also meant she needed to be patient. A single misstep, A single piece of evidence uncovered too soon could alert Damien to the fact that his carefully constructed peace was not as secure as he assumed, giving him time to shore up his defenses before she was ready to move against him. Months passed into a year, and the year passed into two. Ren's body changed under the relentless discipline of her training, growing leaner and faster, every motion refined until it carried none of the softness that had once marked Elena Hartley as a sheltered daughter of privilege. Her face changed too, though more subtly, the open, trusting expression of her youth replaced by something more guarded, more watchful. A woman who had learned the hard way that trust was a currency to be spent carefully, rather than given freely. She began, under Sophie's careful guidance, to take on small tasks for the exile community, accompanying Ivy on trading trips to nearby settlements, gathering information from travelers and merchants who passed through, slowly building a reputation among the scattered exile network as a capable, trustworthy figure known only as Ren. She never used the name Elena. She never mentioned Ashwood or the Hartley bloodline. When people asked about her past, she offered only vague, carefully rehearsed answers that discouraged further questions, and over time, most people stopped asking altogether. It was during one of these trading trips, nearly 2 years after the storm, that Ren first heard Damien Cross's name spoken aloud by someone other than Daniel Pierce, and the sound of it, spoken casually by a stranger, with no idea of the history behind it, sent a jolt through her entire body that she had to work hard to hide. Ashwood's Alpha is having a rough year, the merchant had said, unaware that the quiet young woman across the trading table was listening far more closely than her calm expression suggested. Heard his wife lost a pregnancy last spring. Heard there's grumbling in his own council about how he handled some old territory dispute a couple years back. Powerful pack, still, don't get me wrong. But powerful packs fall apart the same way anyone else does. Slowly, and then all at once. Ren said nothing, simply nodded, and continued the transaction as though the words meant nothing to her. But that night, lying awake in her tent while the sound of the waves rolled steadily against the cove below, she found herself turning the merchant's words over and over, feeling something shift inside her that she recognized, with some surprise, as the first true stirring of hope. Not hope for reconciliation, not hope for anything resembling the life she had once imagined for herself. Hope that the throne Damien Cross had built on a lie was finally, slowly, beginning to crack under its own weight, and that when it finally broke apart completely, she intended to be standing close enough to claim what remained. By the time 3 full years had passed since the night of the storm, Ren was no longer the frightened, half-drowned woman Sophie Marsh had pulled from the rocky shore. She had become something the exile camp itself had never quite produced before. A leader who commanded respect not through inherited title, but through demonstrated skill, patience, and an unshakable calm that steadied even the most anxious newcomers who washed up at the camp's edges. The change had not happened by design. It had happened gradually, the way water shapes stone, through 1,000 small decisions made over hundreds of days. When a dispute broke out between 2 trading families over stolen supplies, it was Ren who mediated the conflict, drawing on lessons Sophie had taught her about reading intentions rather than accusations. When a group of newly exiled shifters arrived at the camp, frightened and half-starved, having fled a pack that had turned violently against them, it was Ren who organized their care, who taught them the same drills Henry Doyle had once taught her, who gave them, in whatever small way she could, the same second chance Sophie's people had once given her. Sophie noticed the shift long before Ren fully acknowledged it herself. "You know they look to you now," Sophie said one evening, the 2 women sitting together on the flat rocks above the cove as the sun set over the water, a ritual they had shared regularly since Ren's earliest days at the camp. "More than they look to me, some days." "That's not true," Ren said, though without much conviction. "It is true, and it should be," Sophie said, unbothered. "I built this place because I needed somewhere safe to survive. You've turned it into something with a future. There's a difference, and it matters more than you think." Ren considered this in silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the water. "I never wanted to lead anything," she finally said. "I wanted to survive long enough to make the people who did this to me answer for it. That's all this was ever supposed to be about." "Maybe that's how it started," Sophie said. "But people change, Ren. Purpose changes. The girl who washed up on that shore 3 years ago wanted revenge. The woman sitting next to me now, I think she wants something bigger than that. I think some part of you has started wondering what you could build, not just what you could tear down. Ren did not answer immediately, but the words settled into her the way Sophie's observations always did, quiet and unhurried, refusing to be dismissed, even when she wanted to dismiss them. She thought of the northern territories, the lakes and forests that had belonged to her family for 6 generations, now sitting under Ashwood control, worked and hunted by people who had no idea the land carried a history of betrayal and blood beneath its surface. She thought of the pack members Daniel Pierce had mentioned, the quiet faction growing uneasy with Damien's leadership, people who might one day need someone to rally behind. She thought, for the first time in years, not just of tearing Damien Cross down from his throne, but of what she might do once he was gone, of the kind of alpha she might become if given the chance. It was Daniel who brought the piece of information, several weeks later, that finally set everything into motion. He arrived at the camp later than usual one evening, his expression tighter than Ren had ever seen it, and asked to speak with her privately before he had even finished dismounting from his horse. They walked together along the cliff path above the cove, far enough from the camp that no curious ears could overhear. "There's a gathering happening in 6 months," Daniel said without preamble. "A regional council meeting, all the northern alphas convening to discuss territory disputes and trade agreements. It happens every few years, and it's usually a formality, but this year it's different. Ashwood is hosting." "Why does that matter to me?" Ren asked, though something in her chest had already begun to tighten with anticipation. "Because Damien Cross will be presenting the Hartley territory absorption as a settled matter of pack law, formally closing the books on it in front of every regional leader," Daniel said. "Once that happens, once every alpha in the north has signed off on it as legitimate, there's no undoing it. No court, no council, no old law will ever reopen the question again. It becomes permanent, uncontestable, forever." Ren stopped walking, staring out over the water, understanding the shape of what Daniel was telling her, before he said it outright. "That's my deadline," she said quietly. "That's your deadline," Daniel confirmed. 6 months. If you're going to move, Ren, it has to happen before that gathering, or the throne you're planning to reclaim will stop being a legal question and start being nothing but a fight, one you'd have to win entirely through force, with no old law left to stand behind you. The following morning, Ren called together the small circle of people who had become, over 3 years, something like family to her. Sophie, Henry, Ivy, Daniel, gathered in the same canvas tent where Ren had first opened her eyes, after being pulled from the water, the same tent where Sophie had told her, all those years ago, that she would need to become someone very different from the woman who fell off that cliff. "I'm ready," Ren told them. "It's time to go back." Sophie studied her for a long moment, the same searching look she had given Ren on that very first night, though now, 3 years later, what she found there seemed to satisfy her far more completely. "What's the plan?" Sophie asked. "I need to move slowly, carefully, and I need to move now," Ren said. "I can't walk back into Ashwood territory as Elena Hartley, not yet, not with a story that sounds like a ghost story instead of the truth. I need proof of what happened that night, proof that will hold up in front of every regional alpha at that gathering, and I need allies inside Ashwood who are ready to stand with me the moment the truth comes out." "That's a great deal to accomplish in 6 months," Henry said, not unkindly, but with the caution of a man who had seen many ambitious plans collapse under their own weight. "I know," Ren said. "That's why I'm not doing it as Elena Hartley, and I'm not doing it alone. I'm going in as Ren, a neutral broker with no history anyone recognizes, offering alliance and trade to the smaller packs along Ashwood's border, packs that have been struggling under Ashwood's shadow, packs that might be willing to talk if the right person approaches them the right way. And once you're inside that world again," Sophie said slowly, "once you're close enough to gather what you need, then I find Oliver Bennett," Ren said, her voice steady despite the tightness that gripped her chest at the thought of seeing him again after 3 years of silence. If anyone inside Ashwood still remembers what really happened that night, if anyone has kept looking for the truth even after everyone else accepted the official story, it will be him. The plan, once spoken aloud, felt both more real and more daunting than it had in the quiet privacy of Ren's own thoughts. But watching the faces of the people gathered around her, Sophie's steady confidence, Henry's careful consideration, Ivy's fierce readiness, Daniel's quiet calculation already turning toward logistics and timing. Ren felt something settle firmly into place inside her, a conviction that had been building slowly for 3 years and had finally found its moment to act. Over the following weeks, the camp transformed into something resembling a small operation headquarters. Daniel began mapping out the border packs most likely to respond favorably to an outside broker, using his network of contacts to identify which territories held the deepest grievances against Ashwood's expansion. Ivy worked with Ren to construct a full false history for her new identity, complete with supporting details, a fabricated trading background, and even a handful of genuine contacts among human settlements who could vouch, if ever asked, for having done business with a broker named Ren over the past several years. Henry drilled her relentlessly in combat once more, sharpening skills that had grown strong over 3 years, but needed to be honed to a razor's edge before she walked back into a world where a single mistake could mean her death, this time permanently. Sophie, meanwhile, focused on something Ren found harder to prepare for than any physical training. She spent long evenings walking Ren through every possible emotional confrontation she might face, forcing her to sit with the discomfort of imagining Damien Cross's face across a negotiating table, imagining Nathan Cole's voice, imagining the moment, however far off it might be, when she would finally have to decide what justice actually meant to her. Revenge and justice aren't always the same thing, Sophie told her, during one of these sessions, the two of them sitting by the fire, long after the rest of the camp had gone quiet for the night. You need to know, before you walk back into that world, which one you're actually chasing. Because the moment will come when you have to choose, and if you haven't decided ahead of time, you'll freeze, or worse, you'll make a choice you can't take back. I don't know yet, Ren admitted, the fire casting long shadows across her face. I used to think I wanted him to suffer exactly the way I suffered. Now, I think what I want most is for the truth to matter, for people to know what he did, and for the land my family protected for 6 generations to go to someone who will actually protect it, instead of someone who stole it through a lie. Sophie nodded slowly, seeming satisfied, at least for now, with the honesty of the answer. That's a good place to start, she said. Just remember, Ren, the plan you build tonight might not survive contact with the man himself. People like Damien Cross are rarely as simple in person as they are in memory. Be ready for that too. 6 weeks later, with her false identity fully constructed, her training sharpened to its finest edge, and a small network of contacts along Ashwood's border, already primed to expect her arrival, Ren stood once more at the edge of the cove, where her old life had washed ashore 3 years earlier, looking north toward the territory she intended to reclaim. Behind her, Sophie, Henry, Ivy, and Daniel stood in a loose half-circle, the closest thing to family Ren had known since the night of the storm. We'll be here, Sophie said simply, whenever you need us, whatever happens up there. Ren turned back toward the water one final time, remembering the cold, the current, the desperate will to survive that had carried her to this exact shore 3 years before. Then she turned north, toward Ashwood territory, toward the man who believed her dead, and began walking. The border territory of Millstone Pack sat exactly where Daniel Pierce's information said it would, a modest stretch of forest and farmland squeezed between the eastern edge of Ashwood's expanded holdings, and a range of rocky hills too poor in resources for Damien Cross to have bothered claiming outright. It was here, in a small trading post on the edge of Millstone lands, that Ren arranged her first meeting under her new identity, sitting across a scarred wooden table from a heavyset man named Gareth Holt, the beta of Millstone Pack, and, according to Daniel's contacts, the man who effectively ran the pack's affairs, while its aging alpha grew increasingly disinterested in the burdens of leadership. A broker with no pack affiliation, Gareth said, studying her with open suspicion. Forgive me if that sounds like something dressed up to look better than it is. I understand the skepticism, Ren said, keeping her voice even, unhurried, exactly the way Sophie had trained her to sound when the stakes were highest. But independence is exactly why I can offer Millstone something Ashwood never will. Ashwood negotiates from strength, always. Whatever deal your pack signs with them will always favor them first. I have no territory of my own to protect, no pack loyalty to weigh against yours. I negotiate purely on what benefits the people sitting across the table from me. Gareth's eyes narrowed slightly, though Ren could see the words landing exactly as she had intended. And what exactly are you proposing? Trade routes that don't run through Ashwood checkpoints, Ren said. I have contacts along the coast, and further south, who would pay fair prices for Millstone's timber and grain. Prices better than what Ashwood currently offers, without the tariffs your pack has been forced to accept for the privilege of crossing their land. It was, in truth, only partially a lie. Ivy Sinclair's years of trading experience had given Ren genuine contacts, capable of moving goods through alternate routes, and the arrangement she offered Gareth Holt was a real one, beneficial on its own merits regardless of Ren's deeper purpose. This was, Sophie had taught her, the foundation of any successful long game. Build trust on something true, something that delivers real value, and the lies woven around it become far more difficult to unravel, because the person on the other side of the table has genuine reasons to want the relationship to continue. Gareth Holt studied her for a long moment, then extended a broad hand across the table. We'll try it, he said. One shipment, to start. If your people deliver what you're promising, we'll talk about more. It was a small victory, but it was the first thread in what Ren intended to weave into something much larger. Over the following 2 months, she repeated versions of this same negotiation, across 5 different border packs, each one struggling under the weight of Ashwood's growing dominance in different ways, each one grateful for an alternative that did not require bending the knee to Damian Cross's expanding influence. She delivered on every promise, using Ivy's network to ensure the trade routes functioned exactly as described, building a reputation among these smaller packs as someone whose word could be trusted, even as she carefully avoided any direct mention of Ashwood's internal politics, any hint that her interest in the region ran deeper than simple trade. It was during her 3rd visit to Millstone territory that she first heard Damian Cross's name spoken by someone who had actually met the man, rather than merely heard of him from a distance. Gareth Holt, having grown considerably more comfortable in Ren's presence after 2 successful trade shipments, mentioned it almost in passing over a shared meal at the trading post. Ashwood's Alpha sent someone here last month, sniffing around about our new trade arrangements. Didn't like it much, from what I heard. His man asked a lot of questions about who we were dealing with. Ren kept her expression carefully neutral, though her pulse quickened. What did you tell them? Told them the truth, mostly, Gareth said with a shrug. Independent broker, good prices, no complaints. Didn't mention your name specifically, if that's what you're worried about. We don't advertise our business partners to nosy neighbors, especially not ones who've never once offered us a fair deal themselves. The news confirmed something Ren had suspected but not yet had proof of. Damian was paying attention to the shifting loyalties along his borders, which meant her presence, even carefully disguised, had not gone entirely unnoticed. It was a risk she had accepted from the beginning, but hearing it, confirmed, sent a fresh jolt of urgency through her plans. She needed to move faster, needed to make contact with Oliver Bennett sooner than she had originally planned, before Ashwood's growing suspicion turned into something more dangerous. The opportunity came sooner than expected, and from an unlikely direction. 3 weeks later, while overseeing a trade shipment at a small crossing point between Millstone and a neighboring territory called Bramblewood, Ren found herself face to face with a familiar figure she had not anticipated encountering so soon. Ethan Reeves, Damian's beta, stood on the far side of the crossing point, overseeing what appeared to be a routine border patrol, alongside 2 younger enforcers Ren did not recognize. He had aged in the 3 years since she had last seen him, gray beginning to streak through his dark hair, but his broad, watchful presence was unmistakable. The same man whose voice she had overheard through the gap in Damian's study door, discussing her death with the same flat efficiency he might have used to discuss a hunting schedule. For one heart-stopping moment, his eyes swept across the trading party Ren stood among, and she forced herself to remain perfectly still, perfectly composed, trusting the years of careful reconstruction that had turned Elena Hartley's face and bearing into something Ethan Reeves's memory would not immediately recognize. Her hair, once long and dark, had been cut shorter and lightened by years of sun and salt air. Her posture, once carefully cultivated to reflect the graceful bearing expected of a future alpha's mate, had been deliberately roughened by years of training and hard travel. She was, on the surface, nothing like the woman who had disappeared into a storm 3 years earlier. Ethan's gaze passed over her without pausing, moving on to assess the rest of the trading party with the same detached professionalism, and Ren allowed herself to exhale slowly, carefully, once he had turned his attention elsewhere. But the encounter left her shaken, in a way she had not fully anticipated. Standing this close to a man who had been complicit in her murder, watching him go about his routine duties, as though nothing at all had happened, as though a young woman's life had not been casually erased to smooth the path toward a more advantageous marriage, stirred something in Ren that 3 years of careful discipline had not fully extinguished. That night, back at the small camp her trading party had established near the crossing, Ren sat alone by the fire long after the others had gone to sleep, turning the encounter over in her mind. Sophie's warning echoed back to her, spoken so many months earlier. The plan you build tonight might not survive contact with the man himself. She had built her plan around careful patience, around gathering evidence, around finding allies within Ashwood before making any direct move. But standing 3 feet from Ethan Reeves, feeling the old fury rise up sharp and immediate inside her chest, she understood for the first time just how much discipline this next phase would actually require. It was one thing to plan revenge from the safety of a hidden camp, surrounded by people who understood exactly what had been done to her. It was another thing entirely to stand within arm's reach of the people who had done it, and to hold herself back from acting on instinct alone. 2 days later, having completed the trade negotiations at Bramblewood, Ren made a decision she had been circling for weeks, ever since Daniel's warning about the 6-month deadline had first crystallized her plans into motion. She would send word to Oliver Bennett, carefully, indirectly, through channels that could not be traced back to her if intercepted. She spent an entire evening composing the message, discarding draft after draft, searching for words that would convey enough truth to catch Oliver's attention, without revealing so much that the message would be dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. In the end, she settled on something simple, something only Oliver would fully understand. "The oak tree still stands," the message read, though the message carried nothing else, no signature, no explanation. It was a reference to a private memory from their childhood, a game they had played as children, beneath the same old tree where she and Damien had once shared secrets, a game that had involved leaving small coded messages hidden in the tree's roots, messages only the two of them would understand the significance of. If Oliver still remembered, if he was still the same person who had risked everything to warn her 3 years earlier, he would understand exactly what the message meant, and exactly who had sent it. She arranged for the message to reach him through one of Ivy's human contacts, a traveling merchant who occasionally carried letters between distant parties for a fee, with instructions to deliver it discreetly to Oliver Bennett at Ashwood Hall, claiming only that it had come from an old friend who wished to remain anonymous for now. Then there was nothing to do but wait, and hope that somewhere inside Ashwood territory, a man who had once loved her like a sister still carried enough hope in his heart to recognize a message from a woman the entire pack believed had drowned 3 years earlier. The response came 11 days later, carried by the same traveling merchant who had delivered Ren's original message, folded into a small square of plain paper with no signature, exactly as she had asked. She unfolded it with hands that were not quite steady, standing alone near the edge of the millstone trading post where no one could see her face. "The tree has grown, but the roots remember. Meet me where the roots are deepest, when the moon is full." Ren read the words 3 times before the meaning fully settled into her chest, a wave of relief so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. Oliver had understood. He had remembered. And more than that, the phrase "where the roots are deepest" carried a second layer of meaning that only the two of them would recognize, a reference to a small hidden clearing deep in the forest bordering Ashwood territory, a place they had discovered together as children and had never told another living soul about, a place where the old oak's root system spread wide and tangled beneath a natural hollow in the earth, forming a kind of hidden shelter no one else had ever stumbled upon. The full moon was 8 days away. Ren spent those 8 days in a state of careful, controlled anticipation, continuing her trade negotiations along the border as though nothing had changed, while her mind turned constantly toward the meeting ahead. She sent word back to the camp through Daniel's network, informing Sophie and the others of the development, and received in return a short message of caution from Sophie herself. "Trust him, but verify everything he tells you. 3 years changes people, even good people." Ren carried the warning with her as she made her way toward the hidden clearing on the night of the full moon. moving carefully through unfamiliar terrain that had once, in another lifetime, been as familiar to her as her own hands. She had grown up on the borders of this forest, had explored its paths as a child, alongside both Oliver and Damien, and moving through it now, disguised and cautious, stirred a strange, disorienting mixture of memory and estrangement. She reached the clearing an hour before moonrise and settled into the shadows to wait, watching the small hollow beneath the ancient oak's roots for any sign of movement. When Oliver finally arrived, moving quietly through the trees with the careful, watchful gait of someone who had spent years learning to move unseen through pack territory, Wren felt her breath catch in her throat at the sight of him. He looked older than she remembered, the boyish softness of his face replaced by something more careworn, deep shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of years spent carrying a grief he had never been able to fully explain to anyone around him. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, scanning the shadows with obvious caution, and Wren allowed herself one more moment of stillness before stepping forward into the pale moonlight. Oliver froze completely, his entire body going rigid, staring at her as though he were looking at a ghost, which, in a very real sense, he was. "Elena," he breathed, the name barely more than a whisper, thick with disbelief. "I go by Wren now," she said quietly, closing the distance between them. "But yes, it's me." What followed was not the joyful reunion Wren had half imagined during her long journey back toward Ashwood territory. Instead, Oliver's disbelief quickly gave way to something closer to devastation, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch her face, as though needing physical proof that she was truly real, truly alive, standing in front of him after 3 years of believing he had failed to save her. "I thought you were dead," he said, his voice breaking. "I've spent 3 years thinking I sent you straight into their hands. I should have found another way. I should have." "You saved my life," Wren said firmly, cutting through his spiraling guilt. "If you hadn't warned me, I never would have had the chance to run at all. What happened after that wasn't your fault, Oliver. It was theirs." They sat together beneath the ancient oak's spreading roots as the moon rose fully overhead, and Wren told him everything: the fall from the cliff, the exile camp, the 3 years of careful rebuilding that had transformed her from Elena Hartley into someone capable of walking back into this world without immediately being recognized. Oliver listened in near silence, absorbing every detail with the same quiet intensity she remembered from their childhood, when he had always been the one who listened most carefully, who remembered every detail others overlooked. "There's something you need to know," Oliver said, once she had finished. "Something I've been sitting on for a long time, not knowing what to do with it, because I had no one left to bring it to." He reached into a small satchel he carried, and withdrew a folded piece of parchment, worn soft at the edges from years of handling, and passed it to Wren with careful hands. "After you disappeared, I couldn't accept the official story," he said. "Everyone else mourned and moved on, but I kept digging, quietly, carefully, never telling anyone what I was doing. It took me nearly a year, but I found this. It's a written record of the transaction, the transfer of the Hartley territories, dated and signed 3 days before your wedding was even supposed to take place." Wren unfolded the parchment with careful hands, scanning the dense legal language, and felt the cold fury she had carried for 3 years sharpen into something colder and more precise. The document was exactly what Oliver described: proof that the transfer of her family's land had been prepared and finalized days before the wedding ceremony that was supposed to formally trigger it. Proof that the entire marriage had been nothing more than a formality, staged to provide legal cover for a theft that had already been decided upon in advance. "This is enough," Wren said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion building beneath the surface. "This is exactly what I need." "There's more," Oliver said. "Ethan Reeves keeps meticulous records of everything: trade agreements, personnel decisions, private correspondence. If there's a written trail connecting Damien directly to the order that sent enforcers after you that night, it will be somewhere in his private study. I've never had the access or the courage to look for it myself, not without risking everything. But you're willing to help me look now," Wren said, watching his face carefully. Oliver met her eyes without hesitation. "I've spent 3 years grieving a friend I failed to save. If there's any chance to make this right, to bring the truth out into the open, and stop pretending that Damien Cross deserves the throne he built on your murder, I'm not walking away from that chance twice." They spent the remainder of the night planning, carefully and methodically, drawing on everything Wren had learned during her years of training, and everything Oliver knew about the inner workings of Ashwood Hall, from his position as a trusted household member, with access most enforcers never received. Oliver explained that he had, over the years, quietly cultivated relationships with several members of the growing faction, unhappy with Damien's leadership. Older pack members, who remembered the old law more clearly than the younger generation, and who had never fully accepted the speed and convenience with which the Hartley territories had been absorbed. "There's a woman named Claire Whitfield," Oliver said, alpha of a smaller pack to the west, one of the regional leaders who will be attending the gathering in a few months. She's always been skeptical of how quickly everything unfolded after your death. If you could get proof directly in front of her before the gathering, she has enough standing among the other regional alphas to demand a formal inquiry. Wren absorbed this new piece of the puzzle carefully, feeling the shape of her plan sharpen and solidify around it. A written confession, or record, connecting Damien directly to her attempted murder, combined with proof of the territory transfer occurring before the wedding, presented to a skeptical regional alpha, with enough standing to force an inquiry, all of it converging at the exact gathering where Damien intended to formally close the book on the Hartley territories forever. It was, she realized, exactly the kind of opening she needed. "I need access to that study," Wren said. "Soon." "There's a household gathering in 3 weeks," Oliver said. "A formal dinner, marking the anniversary of Damien and Grace's marriage. Security will be focused on the main hall, on the guests, on Damien himself. His private study will be far less watched than usual, especially late in the evening once the celebration is fully underway. Can you get me inside?" Oliver hesitated, and for a moment, Wren saw the full weight of what she was asking him to risk settle visibly across his face. If she were caught inside Ashwood Hall, if her presence were discovered before they had gathered enough proof, the consequences would fall not only on her, but on Oliver as well. A man who had already spent 3 years living quietly under suspicion he had never quite managed to fully shake. "Yes," he finally said. "I can get you inside." "But Wren, if this goes wrong, if you're caught—" "I won't be caught," Wren said, with a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from 3 years of training, designed for exactly this kind of danger. "I've spent 3 years becoming someone who can move through spaces like that without being seen. Trust me, Oliver. I've earned that much." He studied her for a long moment, seeing, perhaps for the first time, the full transformation that had occurred in the years since he had last watched her disappear into the night, fleeing toward a garden gate that had ultimately led her not to freedom, but to a cliff's edge and a storm-tossed sea. Whatever he saw seemed to reassure him, because he finally nodded, extending his hand toward hers in the same manner he had once done as children, sealing a promise between them. 3 weeks, he said. "I'll get word to you with the details, using the same method as before." They parted ways as the sky began to lighten toward dawn, Oliver moving back toward Ashwood Hall with the parchment safely returned to his satchel, Wren melting back into the forest shadows toward the border territories where her trading identity waited to reabsorb her back into its careful cover. As she walked, the weight of the coming weeks settled heavily across her shoulders, 3 years of patience and preparation, finally converging toward a single decisive moment. She thought, as she walked, of Sophie's warning from so many months earlier. The plan you build tonight might not survive contact with the man himself. She had not yet come face to face with Damien Cross, not truly, not in a way that mattered, but she understood now, with a clarity that settled deep into her bones, that the moment was drawing closer with every step, and that whatever plans she had carefully constructed over 3 years of exile would soon be tested against the reality of standing once more in front of the man who had ordered her death. Whether her careful discipline would hold in that moment, or whether 3 years of buried fury would finally demand its own reckoning, was a question Wren did not yet have an answer for. But she intended to find out soon, and she intended to be ready when the moment finally arrived. The night of the anniversary dinner arrived with a clear sky and a bright waxing moon, conditions Wren had spent the previous 3 weeks hoping for. A cloudy night would have offered better cover for slipping through the grounds unseen, but it also would have meant a smaller gathering, less noise and distraction to mask her movements, less chance that every enforcer's attention would be focused inward on the celebration, rather than outward toward the shadows. Oliver had arranged everything with careful precision. A service entrance near the eastern kitchens, rarely watched during large gatherings when most of the household staff were fully occupied with the demands of the evening. A borrowed servant's uniform that would let her move through the halls without drawing immediate attention, provided she kept her head down and moved with purpose. A rough map of the household's current layout, sketched from memory, marking the location of Damien's private study, and the patrol patterns of the enforcers still on duty during the celebration. "The study door has a lock now," Oliver had warned her, during their final exchange of messages before the dinner. "New addition since you left. Ethan had it installed after some sensitive documents went missing a couple years back, though as far as I know, they were never able to figure out who took them or why." Wren had smiled faintly at that detail, wondering privately whether the missing documents Ethan Reeves had never solved might have had something to do with Oliver's own year-long investigation into her disappearance. She did not ask, and Oliver did not offer, but the thought gave her a small measure of confidence heading into the night. Whatever security measures Ashwood had implemented, they had not yet caught the person quietly working against them from the inside for the past 3 years. She arrived at the service entrance just as the sun began to set, moving through the eastern kitchens exactly as Oliver had described, her borrowed uniform drawing no more than a passing glance from the harried kitchen staff already overwhelmed by the demands of preparing for a formal dinner. She kept her head down, carried a tray of empty glasses as though delivering them somewhere purposeful, and made her way steadily through the servant corridors, toward the private wing of Ashwood Hall where Damien's study waited. The corridors, at least, had not changed. Wren found herself moving through spaces she had once walked as a child, spaces that still carried the same worn stone and faded tapestries she remembered from countless visits during the years her family's alliance with Ashwood had been strong and genuine, before ambition had corrupted it into something else entirely. The familiarity struck her harder than she had anticipated, a strange ache settling beneath her ribs even as she forced herself to remain focused on the task at hand. She reached the study door without incident, finding the corridor outside it empty, exactly as Oliver had predicted. The new lock Ethan had installed was a solid piece of ironwork, but Ivy Sinclair had spent considerable time over the past 3 weeks, teaching Wren the finer points of working past exactly this kind of mechanism, using tools no larger than a few slender pieces of metal that Wren now carried concealed within the folds of her borrowed uniform. It took her nearly 4 minutes, longer than she would have liked, her hands working carefully and quietly at the lock, while every distant sound from the celebration filtering through the walls made her pulse quicken with the fear of discovery. When the lock finally gave way with a soft click, she allowed herself only a single breath of relief before slipping inside and easing the door closed behind her. The study was dark, lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through a tall window overlooking the eastern gardens, but Wren had spent enough time memorizing Oliver's descriptions of the room's layout to move confidently toward the heavy desk dominating its center. She worked quickly, methodically, exactly as Sophie had trained her, searching through drawers and cabinets with careful precision, disturbing nothing more than necessary, always mindful of leaving everything exactly as she had found it. The written records Oliver had described were kept in a locked cabinet behind the desk, a second lock that took her nearly as long as the first, but which finally yielded to her careful work. Inside, she found exactly what she had hoped for: ledgers and correspondence, spanning years of Ashwood's political dealings, meticulously organized by Ethan Reeves's careful hand. She found the entry 3 years old, and it made her blood run cold, even though she had known, in theory, what she was looking for. A brief, businesslike record, dated the night of her supposed death, noting the successful resolution of the Hartley situation and the formal initiation of territory transfer proceedings. No mention of grief, no mention of tragedy, only the cold, administrative language of a problem that had been solved. She was carefully photographing the page using a small device Daniel had provided her, one of several pieces of modern human technology the exile camp had learned to make use of over the years, when the study door opened behind her without warning. Wren froze completely, every instinct screaming at her to move, to hide, to do something, but there was nowhere in the small study to conceal herself in time. She turned slowly, bracing herself for the sight of an enforcer, or worse, Ethan Reeves himself. Instead, she found herself face to face with Damien Cross. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light of the hallway behind him, and for one endless, suspended moment, neither of them moved. Wren's heart hammered against her ribs, Every year of careful training screaming at her to fight or flee, but something in Damien's expression held her still, a kind of exhausted confusion that suggested he had not expected to find anyone in his study at all, let alone a stranger going through his private records. "Who are you?" Damien said, his voice low and controlled, though his hand had already moved toward the blade at his belt. "And what exactly are you doing in my study?" Up close, in the pale moonlight, Ren could see how much 3 years had changed him as well. The confident, untroubled bearing she remembered from their childhood had been replaced by something harder, more guarded, deep lines of exhaustion carved beneath his eyes that spoke of a man carrying a weight he had never fully found a way to set down. Whatever satisfaction she had once imagined feeling at seeing him diminished by guilt, the reality of it left her feeling only a strange, hollow ache she had not anticipated. She kept her voice low, disguised, drawing on years of practice to alter her speech pattern into something unrecognizable. "Looking for something that doesn't belong to you," she said. Damien's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the blade at his belt, though he made no immediate move to draw it. "You'll want to explain that a great deal more clearly before I decide what to do with you." "Some debts don't need explaining," Ren said, watching his face carefully, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign that some part of him sensed the truth standing in front of him. She found nothing, only wary confusion, the look of a man confronting an intruder he genuinely did not recognize. The years and the training had done their work more completely than she had even hoped. "You're trespassing in an Alpha's private study during a formal gathering," Damien said. "That's a serious matter, whoever you are. I'd advise you to think very carefully about your next move." For one wild, dangerous moment, Ren considered simply telling him. Standing there in the dim moonlight, 3 years of carefully buried fury rising sharp and immediate in her chest, some part of her wanted nothing more than to watch his face collapse with the shock of recognition, to see him finally forced to reckon with the fact that the woman he had ordered killed was standing very much alive in front of him. But Sophie's training held, even in that charged, dangerous moment. Revealing herself now, without allies fully in place, without the regional gathering yet convened, without Claire Whitfield yet informed of the evidence Ren had spent 3 years gathering, would accomplish nothing except giving Damien time to prepare his defenses, to bury whatever evidence remained, to eliminate whatever threat she posed before she could bring the truth fully into the light. "My next move is leaving," she said instead, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the window rather than the door, calculating the distance to the eastern gardens below, with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 3 years training for exactly this kind of escape. "I don't think so," Damien said, finally drawing his blade, moving to block her path toward the door, though the window remained open behind her. "You don't have a choice," Ren said, and before he could close the distance between them, she moved. She had trained for years under Henry Doyle's careful guidance, learning to read an opponent's weight shift a half-second before they moved, and she used every ounce of that training now, ducking beneath Damien's first attempt to grab her, twisting past his outstretched arm, and reaching the window in 3 swift strides. She was through it, and dropping into the garden below, before he had fully recovered his balance, landing in a controlled roll that absorbed the impact of the fall exactly as Henry had drilled into her over hundreds of practice sessions. Behind her, she heard Damien shouting for the enforcers stationed near the main hall, his voice carrying an urgency that told her the alarm would spread quickly. But Ren was already moving, cutting through the eastern gardens toward the outer wall, drawing on years of memorized escape routes that Oliver had carefully mapped out for exactly this possibility. She cleared the outer wall just as the first enforcers reached the garden behind her, disappearing into the tree line beyond Ashwood's boundaries, with the evidence she had come for safely secured, her heart still hammering from the closeness of the encounter, and from something else entirely, something she did not have time to examine fully, until she was well clear of Ashwood territory, and moving steadily back toward the border. She had stood, for the first time in 3 years, close enough to touch Damien Cross. She had heard his voice directed at her, not with love or duty or even recognition, but with the wary caution of a man confronting a stranger. And somewhere beneath the satisfaction of a successful mission, beneath the cold weight of the evidence now secured in her possession, Ren found herself troubled by an uncomfortable truth she had not expected to confront so soon. Whatever certainty she had carried into that study about the nature of the man she intended to bring down, standing close enough to see the exhaustion etched into his face. The weight he seemed to be carrying had left her with more questions than she had walked in with. She pushed the thought aside as she made her way back toward the border, telling herself firmly that whatever guilt Damien Cross appeared to be carrying changed nothing about what he had done, changed nothing about the fact that he had ordered her death and built his throne upon the theft of everything her family had once protected. But the doubt lingered anyway, quiet and persistent, all the way back to the safety of the border territories. The evidence Wren carried back from Ashwood Hall proved both more valuable and more complicated than she had anticipated. Spread across the small table in her tent at the border camp, the photographed pages told a story that was not quite as simple as the one she had carried in her heart for 3 years. The ledger entry, confirming the territory transfer's early completion, was damning enough on its own. Clear proof that the wedding had been staged as nothing more than legal cover for a theft already finalized days in advance. But as Wren worked through the remaining pages over the following days, cross-referencing dates and names with information Daniel Pierce had spent months gathering from his network of contacts, a more troubling picture began to emerge. The order to eliminate her that night, the specific instruction that had sent Nathan Cole and his fellow enforcers to the cliff path in the storm, did not appear anywhere in Damien's direct handwriting. Every reference to the night of her disappearance in the study's records had been drafted and signed by Ethan Reeves alone, with Damien's name appearing only in the earlier planning around the territory transfer itself, the political maneuvering that had set the entire scheme into motion. "It doesn't mean he's innocent," Sophie said carefully, when Wren traveled back to the coastal camp to lay out everything she had found and consult with the people who had helped shape her into someone capable of finding it. "An Alpha is responsible for what happens under his command, whether he signed the order himself or not." "I know that," Wren said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "But it changes things. If Ethan acted on his own initiative, if he interpreted some vague instruction from Damien as license to have me killed, rather than simply removed from the political picture, that's a different kind of guilt than a man who wrote out an execution order with his own hand." Henry Doyle, listening quietly from the corner of the tent, spoke up with the measured caution of a man who had spent decades in pack politics before his exile. "In my experience, that ambiguity is rarely accidental. Powerful men learn early how to give orders that keep their own hands clean while still ensuring the outcome they want. It's entirely possible Damien never spoke the words directly, and equally possible he made his wishes clear enough that Ethan understood exactly what was expected, without needing anything written down." Wren turned this possibility over carefully, feeling the neat, satisfying shape of her revenge grow more complicated with every piece of new information. She thought of Nathan Cole's voice cracking in the storm, of his whispered apology moments before she had been pushed from the cliff. He didn't want it to be like this, for what it's worth. At the time, she had dismissed the words as a coward's attempt to ease his own conscience. Now, weighing them against the possibility that Ethan Reeves had acted with more independent cruelty than Damien had explicitly ordered, she found herself wondering whether Nathan's words had carried more truth than she had allowed herself to consider. "I need to talk to Nathan Cole," she said finally, the decision settling into place with sudden clarity. "That's an enormous risk," Sophie said immediately. "He's one of the few people who might actually recognize you, even through everything you've changed. He held your wrist that night, Wren. He looked into your eyes while he was dragging you toward that cliff. That kind of memory doesn't fade the way a passing acquaintance's memory might." "I know," Wren said. "But he's also the only person who can tell me exactly what instructions he was given, and by whom. If I'm going to bring this to Claire Whitfield and the Regional Council, I need to understand the full truth of what happened, not just the parts that are convenient for the story I've been telling myself for 3 years." It took another 2 weeks of careful planning to arrange a safe meeting with Nathan Cole, working through an intermediary, Oliver identified as someone Nathan trusted, a fellow enforcer who had grown quietly disillusioned with Ashwood's leadership in the years since Elena Hartley's disappearance. The intermediary arranged for Nathan to travel to a remote hunting lodge near the border under the pretense of a routine patrol assignment, giving Wren a narrow window to approach him without drawing Ashwood's broader attention. She arrived at the lodge disguised once more, her identity as Wren fully intact, though this time she carried a concealed blade and every ounce of caution 3 years of training had instilled in her. Nathan arrived alone, exactly as arranged, and Ren watched him from the shadows for several long minutes before finally stepping forward into the lodge's dim interior. The moment he saw her face clearly in the lantern light, something shifted in his expression, a slow dawning recognition that spread across his features, like ice cracking across a frozen lake. "No," he breathed, taking an involuntary step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward his blade, before falling still, as though some part of him understood immediately that violence was not what stood before him. "It's not possible. I watched you fall. I watched the water take you." "Water doesn't always keep what it takes," Ren said quietly, echoing the words Sophie had spoken to her on the very night she had washed ashore. Nathan stared at her for a long, silent moment, his face cycling through disbelief, shock, and finally something that looked remarkably like relief, an emotion Ren had not expected and did not immediately trust. 3 years, he said finally, his voice unsteady. 3 years I've carried what I did that night. 3 years of telling myself I had no choice, that orders were orders, that I did what I had to do to survive in a world where refusing an Alpha's command means exile or worse. And every single day, it's felt like a lie. "Whose orders, Nathan?" Ren asked, her voice sharp with 3 years of carefully controlled fury, finally finding an outlet. "I need the truth. All of it. Whose orders sent you to that cliff that night?" Nathan was silent for a long moment, his jaw working, as though physically wrestling the words free from wherever he had buried them for 3 years. "Ethan Reeves gave the direct order," he finally said. "Told us it came straight from Damien, that the Alpha wanted it handled quietly, that he wanted it to look like an accident so there would be no questions, no complications with the territory transfer." "Did you ever hear Damien say those words himself?" Ren pressed. "Not through Ethan, directly." Nathan's silence stretched longer this time, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "No," he admitted. "I never heard it from him directly. I just believed Ethan. Because why would anyone lie about something like that? Why would Ethan take that kind of responsibility onto himself if the order hadn't actually come from Damien?" It was the question Ren herself had been turning over for weeks, and she found she had no easy answer to offer him. Instead, she asked the question that had brought her to this lodge in the first place. "Would you testify to that, in front of the regional council, if it came to that? Would you tell them exactly what you told me?" Nathan's face went pale, the full weight of what she was asking finally settling across his features. "That would mean admitting what I did," he said. "It would mean confessing to attempted murder in front of every Alpha in the region. Ren, they'd execute me for that. Pack law doesn't forgive that kind of crime, no matter what excuse I offer for why I followed the order." "I know," Ren said, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant the sympathy in her voice. 3 years of anger toward Nathan Cole had softened, standing in this dim lodge, into something more complicated, a recognition that he too had been a piece, moved by forces larger than himself, trapped in a hierarchy that punished disobedience as severely as it now threatened to punish the truth. "But I need the truth to come out, Nathan, not just for my sake, for every person Ashwood has wronged since, and every person they'll wrong in the future if nothing changes. I can't promise you safety, but I can promise you this. Whatever happens, the world deserves to know the truth of what happened that night, and you have the chance right now to be the person who finally tells it, rather than the person who spends the rest of his life hiding from it." Nathan was silent for a long time, staring down at his own hands, as though seeing them for the first time in years. When he finally looked up, something had shifted in his expression, a kind of weary resolve settling into place, where fear had stood only moments before. "I'll testify," he said quietly. "Whatever happens to me afterward, I'll testify to exactly what I told you tonight." It was not the outcome Ren had walked into the lodge expecting, but it was, she understood, as she made her way back toward the border camp under the cover of darkness, exactly the outcome she needed. A witness willing to testify that the order for her death had passed through Ethan Reeves, without clear confirmation, it had originated with Damien himself, complicated the story she intended to bring before the regional council, but it also strengthened the overall case, in a way pure assumption never could have. Whatever the full truth turned out to be, whether Damien had given the order directly, or had simply created an environment where his beta felt empowered to commit murder on his behalf, the responsibility for her death, and the theft of her family's land, ultimately rested with him either way. But the encounter left her with something else as well, a growing awareness that the story she was building was not a simple tale of a single villain and a wronged heroine, but something far more tangled, involving a web of complicity and fear and ambition that extended through the entire structure of Ashwood's leadership. Ethan Reeves, whatever his exact motivations, had built the machinery of her murder with his own hands. Nathan Cole had carried out the order, despite clear reservations, trapped by a hierarchy that punished disobedience without mercy. And Damien himself, whatever the precise wording of his instructions, had created the conditions that made all of it possible, had built a pack culture where an order to eliminate an inconvenient political obstacle could be carried out without hesitation or meaningful consequence. As the gathering of regional alphas drew closer, now only weeks away, Wren understood that the reckoning she had spent 3 years preparing for would not be as simple as she had once imagined. It would require careful navigation, not just of Damien's guilt, but of an entire system that had made his betrayal possible in the first place, a system she intended, if she succeeded in reclaiming her rightful place, to dismantle far more thoroughly than a single confrontation could ever accomplish on its own. Claire Whitfield received Wren in a modest meeting hall on the western edge of her territory, a woman whose sharp, assessing gaze reminded Wren immediately of Sophie Marsh, though the resemblance ended there. Where Sophie carried the weathered practicality of someone who had built a life outside pack structures entirely, Claire moved with the confident authority of an alpha who had spent decades navigating the treacherous currents of regional politics without ever losing her footing. An independent broker requesting a private audience, Claire said, studying Wren across the width of a long wooden table. That alone tells me you're not really here about trade routes. You're right, Wren said. I'm here about the Hartley territory transfer, and about what actually happened to Elena Hartley 3 years ago. Something shifted behind Claire's careful composure, a flicker of genuine interest replacing the polite skepticism she had worn since Wren's arrival. That's a subject I've had questions about for a long time, Claire said. Questions no one at Ashwood has ever been willing to answer satisfactorily. What exactly do you know? Wren spent the following hour laying out everything she had gathered over 3 years of careful investigation. The ledger entry proving the territory transfer's suspicious timing, Nathan Cole's account of the order that sent enforcers to the cliff that night, the broader pattern of Ashwood's expansion that had left several border packs increasingly resentful of Damien's growing dominance. She did not, in that first meeting, reveal her own true identity, presenting the evidence instead as information gathered through her broker's network of contacts, a careful distinction Sophie had insisted upon during their planning sessions back at the coastal camp. Reveal too much too soon, Sophie had warned her, and you risk Claire dismissing the entire case as a personal vendetta rather than a legitimate concern for regional justice. Let the evidence speak for itself first. Save your own reveal for the moment it will carry the most weight. Claire listened to everything with the careful attention of a woman weighing evidence rather than emotion, occasionally interrupting with sharp, pointed questions that tested the strength of every claim Wren presented. By the time Wren finished, the Western Alpha sat back in her chair, arms crossed, a deep frown creasing her forehead. If even half of what you've told me is true, Claire said slowly, it represents one of the more serious violations of pack law I've encountered in my time as Alpha. Territory obtained through fraud and murder, disguised as a legitimate transfer. If I bring this before the regional council at the upcoming gathering, it will force a formal inquiry, one that could unravel every agreement Ashwood has built over the past 3 years. That's exactly what needs to happen, Wren said. Claire studied her for a long moment, something calculating and curious in her expression. You've gone to considerable lengths for someone whose only stated interest is trade, she said. Brokers' networks don't usually invest years of effort investigating a single alpha's private conduct, not unless they have a personal stake in the outcome. Wren held her gaze steadily, feeling the moment of full revelation approaching faster than she had originally planned, though everything in her training told her the timing was right. You're correct, she said. I do have a personal stake. She reached up and, for the first time since walking into Ashwood territory years earlier under her new identity, allowed herself to speak in her own true voice, the careful disguise she had cultivated for years, falling away as she said the words she had been waiting 3 years to speak aloud to someone with the power to act on them. My name is Elena Hartley, she said. I did not drown 3 years ago. I was pushed from that cliff by Damien Cross's enforcers, on orders that trace back through his beta, in order to complete a theft of my family's territory that had already been finalized before my supposed wedding ever took place. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy across the meeting hall. Claire Whitfield stared at her, with an expression that shifted slowly from shock through careful reassessment, her sharp eyes scanning Wren's face, as though searching for some remnant of the young woman she had likely met briefly, years earlier, at some regional gathering or another. Elena Hartley, Claire said finally, testing the name aloud as though weighing its full implications. You understand what you're asking of me. If I bring this to the council with you standing beside the evidence, alive, it will not simply be a formal inquiry into misconduct. It will be a direct challenge to Damien Cross's legitimacy as Alpha, and to every agreement his leadership has built since your supposed death. I understand exactly what I'm asking, Wren said. I've spent 3 years preparing for it. Claire was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the wooden table as she weighed the enormity of what stood before her. The gathering is in 3 weeks, she finally said. I'll need everything you have, organized clearly, and I'll need you present, in person, when I bring it before the council. This isn't a decision I can carry alone. The other regional alphas will need to hear your account directly, and they'll need to see the evidence for themselves. I'll be there, Wren said. There's something else you should consider, Claire added, her expression softening slightly, the careful politician giving way, briefly, to something more personal. Once you walk into that gathering and reveal yourself, there's no going back to the quiet life you've built these past 3 years. Whatever happens, whether the council rules in your favor or not, every pack in the region will know your face, your name, your story. You'll be stepping fully back into a world that already tried to kill you once. I know, Wren said quietly. I've had 3 years to prepare for that too. The following 3 weeks passed in a blur of careful, meticulous preparation. Wren traveled back to the coastal camp one final time, gathering Sophie, Henry, Ivy, and Daniel to finalize every detail of the plan, ensuring the evidence was organized clearly enough to withstand scrutiny, ensuring Nathan Cole's willingness to testify remained firm, despite the enormous personal risk it carried for him, ensuring Oliver Bennett understood exactly what role he would need to play once the truth finally came to light within Ashwood's own walls. Sophie, watching Wren pack the last of her carefully organized evidence into a satchel on the morning of her departure toward the gathering, pulled her aside for one final conversation before she left. Whatever happens in that room, Sophie said, remember what you told me, all those months ago, about what you actually wanted from this. Not just Damien's downfall, something bigger, the chance to build something better than what was taken from you. I remember, Wren said. Good, Sophie said, pulling her into a brief, fierce embrace. Then go finish what you started. We'll be here, whatever the outcome. The regional gathering was held, as it had been for generations, in the great hall at the heart of Ashwood territory, the same hall where Wren had once stood dressed in white, moments away from a wedding that had nearly become her death sentence. Walking through its doors once more, 3 years later, dressed not in a wedding gown, but in the simple, practical clothing of the woman she had become, Wren felt the full weight of the journey settle across her shoulders. The hall was filled with regional alphas and their advisors, dozens of powerful figures gathered from across the north, all present to witness what they believed would be a routine formality, the final closing of the Hartley territory question. Damien Cross stood at the head of the hall, dressed in the formal bearing of an alpha hosting his peers, Grace Sullivan beside him, Ethan Reeves standing watchfully near the back of the assembled council. Claire Whitfield rose to speak, precisely when the formal proceedings reached the moment set aside for finalizing the territory question, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall. Before this council formally closes the matter of the Hartley territories, Claire announced, I have evidence that requires this body's immediate attention, evidence that suggests the transfer we are being asked to ratify today was obtained through fraud, and that the woman we believe died 3 years ago did not in fact drown. A ripple of shocked murmuring swept through the hall, and Wren watched Damien's face from the shadows near the entrance, watched the color drain from his features as Claire continued speaking, laying out the evidence methodically before the assembled council. When Claire finally gestured toward the entrance, inviting the witness she had promised the council to step forward, Wren walked out of the shadows and into the full light of the great hall for the first time in 3 years. The hall fell into absolute stunned silence. Damien Cross stared at her from across the room, his face cycling through disbelief, shock, and something else Wren could not immediately name. Something that looked almost like grief resurfacing in real time. 3 years of carefully buried guilt, finally forced into the open, in front of every powerful figure in the region. "Hello, Damien," Wren said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "I believe there's something we need to discuss." For a long, suspended moment, no one in the great hall moved. Damien Cross stood frozen at the head of the room, staring at the woman he had believed dead for 3 years, his face a battlefield of emotions he could not fully hide from the dozens of powerful eyes now watching his every reaction, with sharp, calculating interest. "This is not possible," he finally said, his voice unsteady, in a way Wren had never heard from him before, not even in their most difficult childhood arguments. "Elena is dead. I watched the search parties comb those cliffs for a week." "You watched search parties look for a body that was never going to wash ashore," Wren said, walking further into the hall, every eye in the room tracking her movement. "Because I survived the fall you ordered, and I have spent every day since building the case I intend to present to this council today." "I never ordered your death," Damien said, and something in his voice carried a raw, desperate honesty that gave several of the watching alphas visible pause. "Whatever you've been told, whatever evidence you believe you have, I never gave that order." It was, Wren realized, exactly the response Sophie had warned her to prepare for, and exactly the complication she had spent weeks wrestling with, ever since her conversation with Nathan Cole at the hunting lodge. She turned to address the full council, rather than Damien directly, understanding that the truth she needed to establish here was larger and more important than a single confrontation between two people. "I have evidence proving the Hartley territory transfer was finalized 3 days before my wedding was ever meant to take place," she said, gesturing toward Claire Whitfield, who stepped forward carrying the documentation Wren had gathered from Damien's own study. "Proof that the marriage itself was never intended to unite our families, but simply to provide legal cover for a theft already decided upon in advance." The murmuring in the hall grew louder as Claire distributed copies of the ledger entry among the assembled alphas, several of them examining the dated signatures with expressions of open disapproval, directed toward Damien. "I also have a witness," Wren continued, "willing to testify that the order sending enforcers after me that night was given by Ethan Reeves, on the claimed authority of Damien Cross." At this, every eye in the hall turned toward Ethan, who stood near the back of the assembly, his broad face gone rigid with the sudden, unwelcome attention. For a moment, Wren thought he might attempt to flee, but the hall was too crowded, too watchful, and instead he stood frozen, caught fully in the light of a truth he had clearly hoped would remain buried forever. "Ethan," Damien said slowly, turning to face his beta with an expression that suggested genuine confusion, rapidly curdling into something far more dangerous. "Tell them this isn't true. Tell them you never gave that order." Ethan's silence, stretching long and damning across the hushed hall, answered the question more completely than any words could have. "I did what I believed needed to be done," Ethan finally said, his voice low, but carrying clearly in the absolute stillness of the room. "The territory transfer was too important to risk complications. I made a decision to ensure it went through cleanly, without interference." "Without my knowledge," Damien said, his voice rising now, the shock and grief in his expression sharpening rapidly into fury. "You ordered a woman's death, Ethan. You ordered Elena's death, and you let me spend 3 years believing it was an accident. You let me carry that grief without ever telling me the truth. You wanted the territory," Ethan said, something defensive and bitter creeping into his tone, now that the truth had been forced fully into the open. "You wanted the marriage to Grace Sullivan finalized, without complication. I gave you exactly what you wanted, and you never asked too many questions about how it was accomplished, because some part of you already understood." The accusation hung heavy in the air, and Wren watched Damien's face carefully, searching for the truth beneath his reaction. Whatever complicated tangle of ambition and willful blindness had existed within him 3 years earlier, whatever precise degree of guilt he actually carried for what had happened to her, the raw shock and fury now written across his features felt, to her careful and practiced eye, entirely genuine. Claire Whitfield stepped forward, raising her voice to cut through the mounting chaos and restore order to the hall. "This council will need to determine the appropriate resolution to what has been revealed here today," she announced. "Regardless of the precise chain of command, the fact remains that Elena Hartley's territory was obtained through fraud, and an attempt was made on her life in service of that fraud. Pack law is clear on matters of this severity." "Then let Pack law decide," Wren said, stepping forward once more, her voice steady despite the enormous weight of the moment settling across her shoulders. "I am formally invoking my right, under the old law that governed my family's original alliance with Ashwood, to challenge the current claim to the Northern Territories, and to challenge Damian Cross's continued leadership over lands that were stolen from my bloodline, through fraud and violence." The hall erupted into fresh murmuring at this declaration, several of the assembled alphas exchanging pointed glances, clearly weighing the enormous implications of what Wren was formally proposing. Claire Whitfield, however, nodded slowly, her expression carrying the careful satisfaction of someone watching a plan unfold exactly as anticipated. "The old law does provide for exactly this kind of formal challenge," Claire confirmed, addressing the full council. "Under its provisions, Elena Hartley has the right to demand a trial by combat, or, if she prefers, a formal accounting, before this council of Ashwood's fitness to retain the territories in question." Wren had spent considerable time during her 3 years of training and preparation weighing exactly this choice, understanding that the old law offered her multiple paths toward reclaiming what had been stolen from her. A trial by combat would settle the matter quickly and decisively, drawing on every skill she had spent 3 years sharpening under Henry Doyle's careful instruction. But it would also reduce the complex truth of Ashwood's fraud and corruption down to a single physical contest, one that risked overshadowing the deeper reckoning she believed the pack truly needed. "I choose the formal accounting," Wren said, watching several eyebrows rise across the hall at her decision. "Not because I doubt my ability to win a physical challenge, but because this territory, and this pack, deserve more than a quick resolution through combat. They deserve the full truth, laid bare in front of this council, so that whatever happens next is built on an honest foundation, rather than another convenient story." Damian, standing rigid at the head of the hall, watched her with an expression she could not fully read, some complicated mixture of respect and devastation settling across his features. "You could have simply challenged me outright," he said quietly, more to her than to the watching council. "Ended this in a single confrontation." "I could have," Wren agreed, "but I spent 3 years learning that revenge, built on rage alone, tends to leave nothing worthwhile standing afterward. I want the truth known, fully and completely, not just for my own sake, but for every pack member inside Ashwood, who deserves to understand exactly what kind of leadership they've been living under." The formal accounting that followed stretched across the remainder of that day, and well into the next, a careful, methodical presentation of everything Wren had gathered over 3 years, corroborated by Nathan Cole's testimony, delivered before the full council with a trembling voice but unwavering resolve, and by Oliver Bennett's own account of the warning he had given Wren on the night of her supposed wedding. Ethan Reeves, faced with overwhelming evidence and the collapse of Damian's protection, eventually offered a fuller confession, admitting that while Damian had never explicitly ordered Elena's death, his clear desire to see the territory transfer completed without complication, combined with his willful refusal to ask too many questions about how Ethan intended to ensure that outcome, had created the exact conditions that made the murder attempt possible. By the time the council reconvened to render its judgment, the picture that had emerged was neither the simple story of a single villain that Wren had carried in her heart for 3 years, nor the complete exoneration Damian had initially hoped to claim. It was something more complicated, a portrait of a pack leadership structure where ambition and willful blindness had combined to enable a genuine atrocity, where responsibility spread across multiple hands, even as the ultimate authority and the ultimate benefit had rested with Damian Cross alone. "This council finds," Claire Whitfield announced, her voice carrying the full formal weight of the moment, "that the Hartley territory transfer was obtained through fraud, and is therefore void under the provisions of old law. The Northern Territories are to be returned in full to Elena Hartley, as the rightful and surviving heir of her bloodline." A wave of reaction swept through the hall at this pronouncement, but Claire raised her hand, continuing before the murmuring could fully take hold. Regarding the matter of Ashwood's leadership, she continued, this council further finds that while direct culpability for the attempted murder rests primarily with Ethan Reeves, who is hereby stripped of his position and remanded to face judgment under pack law for his crime, Damian Cross's leadership created the conditions that made this atrocity possible, and his continued fitness to lead Ashwood Pack must now be formally reconsidered. Damian stood motionless as the full weight of the council's judgment settled across him, his throne, his territory, his very legitimacy, as Alpha suddenly balanced on a knife's edge in front of every powerful figure in the region. Ren, watching him absorb the collapse of everything he had built over the past 3 years, felt none of the pure satisfaction she had once imagined this moment would bring. Instead, she felt only the heavy, complicated weight of a truth finally brought into the light, and the growing awareness that the hardest part of what lay ahead of her was only just beginning. The weeks following the council's judgment unfolded with a strange, disorienting mixture of triumph and unfinished business that Ren had not fully anticipated during her 3 years of careful preparation. The Northern Territories were formally returned to her control, the paperwork moving through with the same efficiency that had once stolen them away, though this time backed by the full authority of regional law rather than a lie built on convenience. Ashwood itself entered a period of uncertain transition. The council had stopped short of formally stripping Damian of his title outright, ruling instead that a formal period of probation would determine whether his leadership could be trusted going forward, overseen by a rotating panel of regional alphas who would review his conduct over the following year. It was not the complete downfall Ren might once have imagined wanting, back in her earliest days of grief and fury at the coastal camp, but standing in the aftermath of the council's judgment, she found she had little appetite left for demanding more than the truth itself had already delivered. Ethan Reeves was formally stripped of his position and exiled from Ashwood territory, forbidden from ever holding a position of authority within any pack again, a punishment that fell short of execution only because Ren herself had argued, during the final deliberations, that enough blood and death had already shaped this story, and that a life spent stripped of power and standing carried its own particular weight of consequence. Nathan Cole, whose willingness to testify had provided crucial corroboration for everything Ren presented, received a lighter sentence than he had feared, a period of formal service to the regional council rather than execution, in recognition of the courage it had taken to come forward against his own Alpha's household. Oliver Bennett, whose quiet, patient investigation over 3 years had provided the foundation for everything that followed, was formally recognized by the council for his role in uncovering the truth, and Ren, in one of her first official acts as the restored heir of the Hartley territories, appointed him as her chief advisor, a position he accepted with the same steady loyalty he had shown her since childhood. It was Damian, in the end, who came to find her, nearly a month after the council's judgment, arriving alone at the border of her newly reclaimed territory, with no guards, no formal entourage, nothing but himself, and whatever words he had spent the intervening weeks preparing to say. Ren met him at the edge of the northern lakes, the same lakes her family had protected for 6 generations, now finally returned to her care, the late afternoon sun casting long golden light across water that had once, in another lifetime, felt like the most peaceful place in the world to her. "I didn't order your death," Damian said, without preamble, the words carrying the same raw honesty she had heard from him in the Great Hall weeks earlier. "I need you to understand that, whatever else is true about what I did wrong." "I believe you," Ren said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. 3 years of careful investigation, of weighing evidence against emotion, had left her with a clearer picture of the truth than pure anger ever could have provided. "But belief doesn't erase what you did allow to happen, Damian. You wanted the territory. You wanted the marriage to Grace finalized without complication. You created every condition that made it possible for Ethan to do what he did, and then you spent 3 years accepting the convenient story rather than asking the hard questions that might have uncovered the truth." Damian absorbed this without argument, his shoulders carrying the weight of an admission he had clearly been forced to sit with for weeks. "I know," he said quietly. "I've had a great deal of time to understand exactly how much responsibility rests with me, whatever the precise wording of the orders that were given. I came here today not to argue that point, but to ask what you intend to do with everything that's been restored to you. The territory, The truth, all of it. Ren considered the question for a long moment, watching the sunlight play across the surface of the lake her family had loved for generations. I intend to build something better than what was taken from me, she said finally. Not just reclaim it, but improve it. Strengthen the border alliances I built these past 3 years, the ones based on fair trade, rather than fear of Ashwood's shadow. Establish clearer protections under pack law, so that no future alpha can quietly eliminate an inconvenient political obstacle and call it an accident. That's a good vision, Damien said. Better than anything I managed to build in the years I controlled these lands. It is, Ren agreed, without cruelty, simply stating the fact as she understood it. As for what happens with Ashwood, and with you, that's a question for the Council's probation period to answer, not for me to decide alone. But I'll tell you this much, Damien. Whatever happens to your throne, I have no interest in tearing it down out of spite. I spent 3 years learning that revenge alone builds nothing worth having. If Ashwood emerges from this probation stronger, fairer, more honest than it was before, then some good will have come from all of this, regardless of what becomes of your particular claim to lead it. Damien studied her for a long moment, something complicated and unresolved passing across his features, grief and respect and regret, all tangled together, in a way that Ren suspected would take him far longer than a single conversation to fully work through. For what it's worth, he finally said, echoing, without realizing it, the very words Nathan Cole had spoken to her on the night of the storm. I am sorry. Not for the political calculation, which I understand you'll never forgive, and rightfully so, but for the years you lost, hiding, healing, becoming someone entirely different, because the world I helped build gave you no other choice. Ren nodded slowly, accepting the apology for what it was, an incomplete but genuine acknowledgement of harm that could never fully be undone. I didn't lose those years, Damien, she said. I built them. Everything I am now, everything I intend to build going forward, came from those years. I wouldn't trade them back, even if I could. He left shortly after, walking back toward the border of Ashwood territory alone, and Ren watched him go with a strange, settled calm that surprised her. A peace she had not expected to find so completely on the other side of everything she had spent 3 years working toward. That evening, as the sun set fully over the northern lakes, Sophie Marsh, Henry Doyle, Ivy Sinclair, and Daniel Pierce arrived at the small gathering Ren had arranged to formally establish her new household, the beginning of whatever came next for the territory her family had protected for 6 generations, and had now, against every terrible odds, managed to reclaim. You did it, Sophie said, standing beside Ren as they watched the last light fade over the water, the same ritual they had shared so many times over the past 3 years, now unfolding in a place neither of them could have imagined finding themselves when Ren first washed ashore, broken and barely breathing, on a rocky coastline 2 miles south of here. We did it, Ren corrected gently. None of this happens without everything you taught me, without the family this camp became when I had nothing else left. Sophie smiled, the same small, sharp smile from that very first night, though now it carried none of its old wariness, only warmth. So what happens now, Alpha Hartley? She asked. Now that the throne is finally yours. Ren considered the question, looking out over the lakes her family had loved and protected for generations, the territory finally restored, the truth finally spoken aloud in front of every powerful figure in the region, the long, difficult journey from that stormy cliff to this quiet golden evening, finally, impossibly, complete. Now, she said, we build something worth protecting. And as the stars began to emerge over the northern territories, casting their familiar light across water that had once tried to claim her life, and had instead delivered her into a new one, Elena Hartley, known for 3 long years only as Ren, finally allowed herself to feel something she had denied herself since the night of the storm. Not triumph exactly, and not simple relief, but something steadier and more lasting than either. The quiet, settled certainty of a woman who had lost everything and rebuilt herself into someone capable of reclaiming it, not through rage alone, but through patience, truth, and the unbreakable loyalty of the family she had found along the way. The throne was hers. The pack, in whatever form it would take in the years ahead, waited to be built. And for the first time since the night she had been pushed from a cliff into a raging storm, Elena Hartley looked toward her future with nothing but clear, unclouded hope.